Virgin was forced to marry Ruthless Millionaire after his years of loneliness, but he found love for the first time. The rain hadn't stopped for 2 days. It ran in slick ribbons down the windows of the Hemsley building, veiling the world beyond in streaks of grey. But Charles Hemsley didn't notice. He sat behind his polished oak desk, perfectly still, the kind of stillness that came from years of suppressing anything unnecessary, including emotions. He was 39. His name alone could close deals. But his house remained dark at night, and no one ever asked who waited for him at home. Because no one did. Across the desk lay a single envelope. Cream-colored. Sealed with wax. It had been delivered by hand, not by chance. He knew exactly who had sent it. Mr. Franklin Langford. Once a wealthy landowner. Now, a desperate father trying to preserve what remained of his family's dignity. Inside the envelope was a letter. Simple. Formal. Cold. An offer. A marriage between Charles Hemsley and Langford's only daughter, Margaret, in exchange for the clearing of Langford's crushing debts and the continuation of his family name. Charles didn't blink. He reached for his fountain pen. The ink flowed easily, without hesitation. He signed his name. Not out of desire, but because his legacy required it. 3 states away, Margaret Langford folded a dress she'd worn 3 summers ago. It had faded along the shoulders, and one hem was loose. Still, it was her finest. At 34, Margaret had long accepted the silence of her own name. Suitors had come and gone in her early 20s, but illness swept through her family, leaving her mother in need of constant care and her father with mounting losses from a bad harvest, then another, and then the banks. Now, her mother had been gone for 2 years, and her father's breathing was ragged in the next room. When the letter came from Mr. Hemsley's office, she didn't cry. She read it. Then she read it again. And again. 12 lines. That's all it took to seal her future. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, watching the moonlight fall across the dying rosebushes her mother once tended. By morning, she'd made her decision. Not out of hope, but necessity. She would marry the man her father arranged. Even if she'd never met him. Even if he hadn't written the letter himself. The train pulled into Grand Central 2 days later. Margaret stepped off slowly, her gloved hands clutching a single suitcase. Her coat was thin. Her shoes well worn. But her back remained straight. A man in a dark suit met her on the platform. "Mrs. Hemsley," he greeted, offering a tight nod. "I'm Alden, Mr. Hemsley's driver. Welcome to New York." She wanted to correct him, she wasn't Mrs. Hemsley. Not yet. But the words stayed behind her teeth. The drive was quiet. The city rushed past them in motion and noise, but inside the car, it felt suspended, as if they were moving through something far heavier than time. When they arrived at the courthouse, Charles was already inside. He stood in a charcoal gray suit, glancing over documents. His expression was unreadable, like the closing lines of a book you couldn't quite understand. Margaret approached. Their eyes met. She saw no contempt. No interest. Just nothing. "Miss Langford," he said with a courteous nod. "Mr. Hemsley," she replied. The officiant entered. An assistant offered pens. There were no flowers. No music. Just legal terms and space between them. When asked if she agreed, Margaret answered, yes. Her voice was steady, even as her hands trembled. When Charles was prompted, he looked at her again. Something flickered in his eyes, maybe curiosity, maybe calculation. "Yes," he said. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lift her veil, there wasn't one. Instead, he stepped aside, let her sign her name, and returned the pen with mechanical grace. 15 minutes later, the officiant stamped the document. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Hemsley. Margaret gave a small nod. Charles offered his hand. They shook. Two strangers. One binding contract. That evening, Charles returned to the city. Alone. Margaret was delivered to the estate. A cold, towering house on a hill, with ivy-covered bricks and narrow windows that seemed to watch her. Cora, the housekeeper, greeted her. "Welcome, madam." "Thank you," Margaret said softly. Cora led her through a long hallway. "Your room is upstairs. Mr. Hemsley prefers quiet after his workdays. Breakfast is served at 8. Supper at 6. I understand. You may furnish the room to your liking. The staff will attend to anything you request." Margaret paused. "Does Mr. Hemsley live here?" Cora glanced back. "He visits." Margaret's throat tightened. She walked into the bedroom. It was clean. Spacious. Empty. She unpacked slowly. Placed her mother's brooch on the dresser. Unfolded her diary. Smoothed her skirts. Then she sat by the window. Outside, the roses had long since withered. She wondered if anyone else had seen them bloom. The manor was beautiful, but silent, the kind of silence that pressed against your chest like velvet you couldn't breathe through. Margaret woke early each morning to the chirping of unseen birds beyond the high windows. She rose, made her bed, and dressed in the same few pieces she had packed. No one brought her breakfast. No one asked what she preferred. Downstairs, the staff moved like shadows, polite, quick, careful not to disturb the air. At exactly 8 a.m., breakfast was served in the east dining room. A silver tray, a cup of tea, 2 boiled eggs, toast, and a fruit that never tasted ripe. Cora stood in the corner, watching, waiting. One morning, Margaret tried conversation. "The garden outside, do you know when it last bloomed?" Cora answered with a tone not cruel, just reserved. "Before the mistress passed. Mr. Hemsley's mother." "And no one tended it after?" "No." Silence returned. Even the ticking of the grandfather clock was hesitant, like it didn't want to remind anyone of passing time. Margaret finished her toast and excused herself. She explored the house room by room, each one colder than the last. A study with books still wrapped in untouched leather. A sitting room with a piano beneath a dusted cover. A solarium whose glass walls magnified only the emptiness. At the far end of the west wing, she found a small room with a writing desk. It overlooked the forgotten rose garden. The perfect place to be unnoticed. That became her retreat. Each day, she returned to it with her journal, her silence, and her thoughts. She began to write. Not letters. Not diary entries. Observations. "He eats late, when I've already gone upstairs. The kitchen is quiet, but I hear the soft clink of a fork against china. He always drinks something after. The house is too big for him. It feels borrowed, not lived in. I think he sleeps in only one room, even though there are 15. I've never seen him smile. Not once. The first time they spoke again, it was accidental. She came downstairs early to leave a book in the library. He was already there, seated at the corner of the fireplace, drink in hand, suit jacket off, sleeves rolled just above the wrist. She paused in the doorway. He didn't look up. "You're up early?" "I couldn't sleep." He nodded once, then returned to his glass. Margaret stepped in cautiously. "Do you come here often?" "To read," he said. "To forget." That got his attention. He looked at her. Not with anger, but surprise. "You ask questions. I thought a wife was allowed." "You're not a wife," he said calmly. "You're an agreement." The words struck like frost. She didn't flinch. "I see." He stood, finishing his drink. "Don't take it personally. I'm not built for companionship." "No," she said, voice firm now. You're built for solitude. But solitude wasn't what you signed. He left the room without reply. 3 days passed without a word. Then, without warning, Charles didn't come home. Dinner was served. Then cleared. Margaret waited by the fire, unsure why. At midnight, the sound of a car door snapped the silence. The front door opened. Charles walked in, hair damp from the night air, collar undone, coat slung over one arm. He looked startled to find her still awake. "I couldn't sleep," she said softly. "Neither could I." She motioned toward the teapot. "Would you like something warm?" He didn't move, but after a pause, said, "Yes." They sat in the parlor. Steam drifted between them. Margaret poured the tea, slid a cup toward him. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. He stared at the cup. "I needed a name next to mine on a contract. The board's rules are old-fashioned. Married men get trusted more with power. So I'm a name. You were also the least complicated option." She nodded slowly. "And yet, somehow," she said, "you've made everything around you unbearable." He said nothing. When she stood to leave, he asked, "Why did you agree?" She turned back. "Because I thought being needed would be enough." Then she walked out. It rained the next 3 days. Margaret stayed in the room by the garden, watching the drops fall, her notebook open, but untouched. Each night she sat by the fire. And each night, the chair across from her stayed empty. Until the 4th night. He appeared at the doorframe. No drink in hand. No coat. No mask. He looked tired. "I read your notes," he said. Margaret looked up. "You went through my things?" "They were in the writing room. On the desk." "You left them open." Her breath caught. "That doesn't mean." "I didn't read them all," he said. "Just the one where you said the house isn't lived in." "You were right." She stayed silent. "I remember music in this house," he added. "My mother played. It stopped after she passed." "Is that why the piano's covered?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked to it. Pulled back the cloth. Pressed one key. The sound echoed, soft and hesitant. "You should leave it uncovered," Margaret said. He nodded. Then, just as quietly, he turned and left. That night, Margaret went to the piano. She sat gently. Pressed 2 notes. Her fingers remembered more than she expected. By the time Charles returned from the city the next evening, the music reached him from the hall. He paused at the door. He didn't enter. But he stood there, listening. Until the last note. They began speaking again, slowly. About unimportant things, weather, newspaper headlines, the garden. He asked if she needed warmer gloves. She asked if he'd ever considered trimming the hedges. They didn't share meals. Not yet. But they no longer avoided hallways. And when she lit the fireplace in the drawing room, he stopped walking past it. He started sitting beside her. One night, he asked, "What did you want before all this?" She looked at him carefully. "I wanted a bookstore. Not large. Just a corner. Where people whispered and time slowed down." He tilted his head. "Why didn't you?" She smiled, barely. Life had other plans. "And now?" "Now," she said, "I want a reason to stay." His brow tightened. "Do you?" She turned toward the fire. "I don't know yet." He nodded, then said quietly, "Let me know when you do." The roses were barely more than thorns. Long before Margaret stepped into the overgrown back garden, Cora had warned her, no one's touched it since Mrs. Hemsley died. But Margaret hadn't asked permission. She just found the gloves and shears tucked away in the garden shed and began clearing the first path. It wasn't about flowers. It was about doing something that didn't feel borrowed. The first morning, she clipped dead branches until her wrists ached. A thorn snagged her glove, slicing the skin beneath. She wrapped her hand and returned the next day. By the fourth morning, a patch of soil began to show signs of breath again. On the fifth, Charles came home early. Margaret didn't hear him approach. She was on her knees, sleeves rolled, face damp with effort. "You'll ruin your dress," he said. She didn't startle. "I have two," she replied. "And this one already has a tear." He watched her work. His hands were in his pockets, but his voice was different. "That corner over there, by the gate, that's where the yellow ones used to bloom." "Used to?" she asked. "They haven't in years. Maybe they forgot how." He looked at her a long time before nodding once. "Let me know if you need anything." She looked up. "Can you dig?" He did. That Saturday, Charles took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and helped turn the soil. They didn't talk much. He handed her the small shovel when she asked. She fetched a pail of water when the sun rose high. By midday, both of them stood at the garden edge, hands dirty, sweat across their brows. "I've never seen you work like that," she said. "I used to do more," he said. "Before the suits and meetings." Margaret looked at him. "You seem more alive here." "I feel less expected." They stood there, letting the silence fill without pressure. When he walked back inside, she stayed behind. Her fingers brushed a small bud forming beneath one of the white bushes. A beginning. That evening, he knocked on her door. Not loudly. Just once. She opened it. "I forgot," he said, holding a box. "For your hand." Inside was a fresh roll of bandage wrap, a small tin of ointment, and a pair of new gloves, soft, worn leather with a stitched flower at the edge. "I noticed yours were torn," he said. Margaret stared at them. "Thank you," she said, voice steady but warm. He didn't linger. But he looked as if he wanted to. They settled into a rhythm. Morning garden work. Occasional conversation. Shared presence in the evenings. Nothing forced. Nothing planned. Just the quiet unfolding of days where they no longer avoided being seen. One evening, Margaret returned to the sitting room to find a new book on her chair. A hardbound collection of poems. Inside, a single page had been marked with a ribbon. "Love doesn't always arrive at your door. Sometimes it waits for you to open it." She smiled, not because the words were perfect, but because they were there. That night, she sat at the piano. Her hands moved across the keys, gently at first, then with growing confidence. The tune wasn't complicated. A lullaby her mother once hummed when sleep was hard to find. Halfway through the piece, she felt it. Someone behind her. She turned. Charles stood at the edge of the room, still. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said. "You didn't." He moved closer. "I remember that song," he added. "My mother used to play it, too. Would you like to?" She gestured to the empty bench beside her. He looked hesitant. Then sat. Their shoulders brushed. Her hands resumed the melody. His joined, unsure, clumsy. But they kept playing. Together. Later, as they walked to the staircase, he paused halfway up. "I think I owe you something," he said. Margaret turned. "What?" He took a breath. "An apology. For what I said. When I told you this marriage was an agreement." She met his eyes. "It was." "Maybe," he said. "But it doesn't have to stay that way." Margaret's reply came not in words, but in the way her lips parted, the way she nodded once, and turned toward her room, not closing the door behind her. He didn't follow. Not yet. But something had shifted. The door between them was no longer locked. The following morning, Margaret found an envelope tucked beneath her teacup. A drawing, a sketch of the garden. With blooms filled in, colored softly with pencil. At the bottom, for what could be. She pressed the paper to her chest. She had never imagined receiving courtship after marriage. But perhaps the timeline didn't matter. Only the truth behind it. That evening, she didn't wait for Charles to initiate. She knocked on the door of his study. He looked up, slightly startled, then gestured for her to enter. "I thought we might share supper," she said. He nodded, closing the book in his hand. The meal was simple: roasted chicken, steamed vegetables, and soft bread from the nearby town. But it was the way they passed the salt, the way he refilled her glass, the way she reached for his hand across the table without hesitation, that made it unforgettable. "I don't know how to be a husband," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a wife," she replied. "But we can learn," he said. Margaret looked at their fingers, now gently linked. "I'd like that." The next morning, the first yellow rose bloomed. Not because of luck, but because someone believed enough to dig. The wind arrived before the rain. It howled softly through the tree branches outside Winthrop Manor, whispering warnings that something was shifting. The windows rattled, not from the weather, but from the quiet tensions within. Margaret sat in the reading room, eyes moving slowly across a page, but her mind elsewhere. She had spent the past 2 weeks watching their marriage change, not in grand ways, but in gestures. Shared breakfasts. Long walks through the orchard. Nights by the fire with music and soft conversation. She was beginning to hope. And hope, as she had learned, was both beautiful and dangerous. That evening, while Charles was in the city on business, Margaret wandered through the house with no purpose. She stopped outside his study. The door, usually shut, was slightly open. Inside, the air smelled of parchment and ash. His desk was orderly, the way he always kept it. She didn't mean to intrude. But her fingers brushed the corner of a leather-bound folder. She froze. Inside, half-tucked, was a letter. Not addressed to her. Not recent. Just one word on the front: Isabel. Margaret stared at it for too long. Then she stepped back, just as Charles walked through the doorway. He paused, his eyes moving from her hand to the letter and back. "I wasn't," she began. "I know what you were doing," he said, his tone flat. "I didn't read it. But you touched it." A silence dropped between them, heavier than any storm outside. Charles walked past her, picked up the letter, and slipped it into a drawer. Margaret didn't move. "I wasn't searching," she said. "I was curious." "Curiosity," he replied, "leads to assumptions. And silence leads to suspicion." He turned sharply. "Is that what this is? You're suspicious." "No," she said softly. "I'm uncertain." He exhaled. Not in anger. In frustration. "She was someone I knew before any of this," he finally said. "It ended years ago. But you kept the letter. Because not everything old is a threat." Margaret nodded once. "Neither is everything new a promise." She turned and walked out. That night, the rain came hard. Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't betrayal that haunted her. It was the feeling of being outside the parts of him he had never offered. The letter wasn't the wound. The secrecy was. Charles didn't sleep either. He stood at the window, the fire behind him casting soft flickers across the room. He thought of how her eyes dimmed when she saw that name. How quickly the warmth between them had cooled. It wasn't her fault. He had opened a door, then hesitated to walk through it. He needed to fix that. But not with flowers or gestures. With truth. The next morning, Margaret did not come down for breakfast. Charles asked Cora if she had eaten. "She took tea in her room, sir." He nodded, then walked to the garden alone. The roses were wet, drooping with the weight of the rain. But the soil held firm. As he looked at them, he realized he could lose her, not because she was leaving, but because she might stop reaching. And that terrified him more than he expected. By evening, she sat once again in the library. He entered quietly. In his hand, the letter. He set it down between them. I kept it because she was kind when no one else was. Because it reminded me that I was once capable of being chosen for more than just what I built. Margaret looked at him. I'm not asking you to be empty of your past, she said. I'm asking you to let me into it. He sat down. Everything before you felt like surviving. This feels like living. I don't want to lose that. She touched the envelope. Then slid it back to him. Then show me what comes next. The following day, he took her to a room she had never entered, the drawing archive. Inside were his mother's sketches. Dozens of them. Landscapes, figures, even the manor itself in younger years. I never told anyone these were here, he said. Why no? Because I don't want you to feel like a guest anymore. Margaret stepped forward, examining each one. She had a gentle hand. Charles nodded. So do you. Later, as they walked the orchard paths, Charles stopped beneath the old elm. He turned to her, eyes steady. I haven't said it because I didn't know if I had the right, he began. But if I don't now, I never will. Margaret waited. I'm learning to love you, he said. Not because I must. But because I can't stop myself. She inhaled. Then stepped forward. I've been waiting for you to say that, she replied. Not because I needed to hear it. But because I already knew. They stood there, wind playing gently with her scarf, until he pulled her into his arms, not urgently, not desperately. Just fully. That night, they sat by the fireplace, not needing to talk. His hand rested on hers. The storm had passed. And not a single window broke. The invitation had come weeks earlier, but Charles hadn't acknowledged it. The Winthrop Foundation's annual autumn gala, a night of wealth, influence, and social spectacle. A room filled with polished voices and sharpened glances. He had skipped it for years. Said it was beneath his schedule. But this year felt different. This year, he had Margaret. I'm not sure I belong in that crowd, she said one evening, folding laundry at the edge of the bed. Charles stood nearby, adjusting his cufflinks. You belong wherever you choose to stand, he replied. They'll talk, she said quietly. He paused. Let them. She looked up at him. I'll go, she said. But not to be admired. He stepped closer. No one needs to admire us. They just need to understand we are not something they can define. That night, the car pulled into the marble-lit hotel. Margaret wore a deep green gown, simple and graceful. Her hair was swept up in a twist that revealed the curve of her neck. Charles offered his hand as they stepped from the car. Flashbulbs flared. People murmured. Whispers cut the air. But he didn't let go of her. Inside the ballroom, the music was bright but distant. Crystal chandeliers sparkled. Waiters weaved through the crowd. Voices hovered with calculated warmth. Margaret moved beside Charles like a shadow at first, her chin high, but heart pacing. Then came the first question. Is this the new Mrs. Hemsley? A man asked, swirling wine. Margaret smiled. Not new. Just previously unannounced. Someone chuckled. Another leaned in. You're quieter than his last companions. Charles stepped forward. That's because she doesn't need to perform to be worthy of the room. The group fell silent. Margaret squeezed his hand once, subtly. They moved on. Later, standing near the balcony, Charles handed her a glass. You were composed, he said. I was holding my breath, she replied. Breathe now. She did. And the air felt better. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded slip of paper. What's this? A proposal. Margaret raised an eyebrow. You already married me. Yes. But I never asked you. He opened the note. It was handwritten. If I could choose again, I would choose you. Not for status. Not for peace. But because in your presence, I finally became a man I'm proud of. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sentiment. From recognition. I would have said yes, she whispered. Then let me ask. He held out his hand again, not for a second marriage. But for a new beginning. She took it. They danced for the first time in public that night. It wasn't perfect. He missed a few steps. She laughed once when his foot tapped hers. But the room disappeared around them. And when the music ended, no one whispered anymore. They had nothing left to question. Back home, Margaret removed her shoes and walked barefoot across the cool wooden floor. Charles followed, coat over his shoulder. At the base of the staircase, she turned to him. "Do you know," she said, "I never imagined this version of you existed." "I didn't either," he said. "Until you met me." Later, he showed her a journal. Dozens of pages written over years. Unsent letters. Confessions. Regrets. He handed it to her. "I want you to know me." She flipped through the first page. It read, "They think I'm stone. But I feel everything and show nothing." She looked up. "I already knew." And in that moment, nothing in the house felt distant. Not even the past. They spent the following weeks restoring rooms Charles had ignored for years. They opened shutters. Polished frames. Moved a table beside the window where morning light could land on their breakfast. Margaret brought in books. Not rare ones. Just stories with heartbeat. Charles found a record player. It crackled when the first vinyl spun, but they danced anyway, laughing softly, even if offbeat. They didn't call it love every day. But they lived like it was. One morning, he walked into the garden where Margaret knelt beside the yellow rosebush. "Another bloom," she said. He crouched beside her. "You did this," he told her. "No," she said, brushing soil from her gloves. "We did." He took a folded note from his pocket and placed it in her hand. "What's this?" she asked. "A deed. The bookshop building on 5th Street. It's yours now." She looked up, stunned. "I asked what you wanted," he said. "I was listening." Margaret touched his face, voice trembling. "You remembered." He pressed her hand. "I won't forget again." 3 years later. The garden was in full bloom. Not just the roses. The hydrangeas, the lavender, the wild lilies she had added herself. Margaret stood on the path, a sun hat casting shade across her shoulders, as the breeze caught the hem of her linen dress. Behind her, the house had changed. New curtains. Music most evenings. Fresh bread baking on Sundays. It no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like someone lived there. Charles approached from the orchard, carrying a basket of apples. His walk was slower now, not from age, but from peace. He no longer marched through time. He arrived beside her, kissed her cheek gently. "They bloomed early this year," he said. "They had reason," she replied. He reached into his pocket and handed her a folded piece of stationery. Margaret unfolded it, eyes scanning the words. "To be loved in your own silence, to be held without being told to perform. That is the kind of marriage no vow could promise." She closed the note, touched it to her lips, and smiled. They spent the afternoon on the bench he had built during their first summer together. Its paint had chipped, but Margaret refused to change it. "It carries the memory in every scratch," she often said. Charles leaned back, closing his eyes as she read from a book she'd opened in her lap. He wasn't always listening to the words. Sometimes he just listened to her voice. Inside the manor, Cora poured tea for 2 younger visitors, a newly married couple from town. The bride looked around, awestruck. "It's so warm here." "Not what I expected." Cora smiled. "It wasn't always." What changed it? The husband asked. Cora looked toward the garden, where Charles and Margaret sat under the wide sky. Someone stayed. One autumn morning, Margaret rose early. She moved through the kitchen barefoot, her robe trailing behind her. She found Charles in the reading room. He looked up from his newspaper. "I didn't think you'd be up yet," he said. "I had a dream," she whispered. He folded the paper and set it aside. "Good or bad?" "Neither. Just deep." She sat beside him. "I dreamed I was walking through this house, but I was young again. And every door I opened showed me a different version of my life. A marriage for comfort. A life alone. A life with someone else." Charles watched her carefully. "And which one did you choose?" She smiled. "I didn't. I just kept walking. Until I opened one final door and saw this room, you in that chair, and me realizing I'd stopped searching." He took her hand, kissed the top of it. "You stopped," he said. "But I just began." Later that day, they visited the bookshop. Margaret had named it Langford and Light. Not for the books, but for her mother's maiden name and the feeling she wanted people to have when they walked in. Children sat by the window seat with illustrated stories. Couples browsed poetry shelves. Margaret spoke with the staff about adding a writing circle for local women. Charles watched her from the corner. A man once afraid of being seen, now completely at ease in her shadow. When she finally looked up and caught his gaze, she walked over. "Lost?" "No," he said. "Home." That winter, he took ill for a short time. Nothing serious. But for a few days, the house went quiet again. Margaret read to him by the fire, brought tea with honey, rubbed his back when the coughing started. One night, when he was half asleep, he whispered, "Promise me something." She leaned in. "Don't shrink yourself when I'm gone." Her eyes filled. "You're not going anywhere." "I'm just saying," he said. "This house, this life, it was never mine until you." She nodded, resting her forehead against his. "It wasn't mine until you let me in." Spring returned. Margaret opened the windows. The wind brought the scent of blossoms. The laughter of schoolchildren echoed from the town below. In the garden, the white roses bloomed wider than ever before. Charles walked beside her, arm around her waist. "I wrote something," he said. She looked at him. "It's not for business," he added. He handed her a folded page. Typed. "To love a woman who never asked for wealth, never needed comfort, but simply wanted to be seen. That is the only legacy I hope lasts longer than my name." She blinked back emotion. "It already has." Years later, after Charles passed peacefully in his sleep, Margaret didn't close the doors of the house. She opened them wider. Langford and Light expanded. A reading garden was built in Charles's name. Children still sat by the fireplace. And every spring, the roses still bloomed without fail. One day, a young woman, newly engaged, came to the shop and asked Margaret, now silver-haired but still upright, "How do you know when it's real?" Margaret set down the teacup in her hand. "When they stop trying to impress you," she said, "and start trying to know you." The girl smiled. Margaret reached behind the counter and handed her a wrapped parcel, an old poetry volume, tied in ribbon. "There's a line in there that saved my life once," she said. The girl clutched it like a gift far greater than paper. Margaret turned toward the garden beyond the back windows, where the wind stirred the rose petals like a soft applause. She whispered under her breath, "Thank you for choosing me. My beautiful, loyal family, if you stayed through this journey, then you've just witnessed a story not of perfect beginnings, but of chosen love, the kind that's built through grace, patience, and quiet courage. Now, I ask you, have you ever seen someone grow softer, just because someone else stayed? Have you ever been that person? I'd love to read your heart in the comments. This isn't just my story to tell, it's ours to carry." If this tale spoke to you, I humbly ask, please like this video, share it with someone who still believes in slow love, and subscribe to Love and Twilights with Dr. Phillips. Your support means more than numbers. It tells me these stories matter. Until we meet again, may love always find you, not in grand moments, but in the small ones that never leave.